This podcast will be about methane. In the short term, around 20 years, the warming effect of methane in the atmosphere is around 80 times more powerful than that of CO2. And it's estimated that methane has been responsible for around 30% of global warming since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Now, although recent agreements point to the possibility of reductions in non-natural emissions resulting from human activity, that's to say, continued release from natural sources does still threaten to reinforce global warming, and perhaps very strongly. So these are the themes which we'll talk about. Currently, the main sources of methane, say around 70% in the atmosphere, arise from ruminants, for example cows, and from industrial discharges. It was claimed that global commitments made at COP26 in Glasgow in 2021 could lead to a cut in man-made methane emissions equivalent to 0.2 degrees Celsius by 2050. But in all honesty, there's very little sign so far that any of this has been implemented, and we need to consider not only the human emissions, which are continuing, and the natural emissions.
Okay, so what are the natural sources and why do they pose a future problem?
Well, we'll come to those in a moment. Just another word about the man-made emissions. Very few of them are fully recorded. They're unlikely to be quickly curtailed. Some of the processes, venting and flaring from oil and gas exploration, as well as emissions from coal mining, have never been adequately recorded. So, given that these have led to emissions of many trillions of cubic feet of methane over the last decade. So these are extremely important, but we do have to set them alongside the natural sources, and the overall methane levels in the atmosphere are 3 times pre-industrial levels, and the contribution of the natural sources now appears to be responsible for most of the actual increases in emission over the last 15 years. That's to say, not for the total emissions, but for the actual increases over the last 15 years. And now it's highly likely that polar warming and methane release are linked very closely in a positive feedback loop, by which, in this instance, is very easy to explain. If the polar atmosphere warms, it increases methane release. Methane release increases the polar atmosphere warmth. The polar atmosphere warmth increases methane release, and the two things reinforce each other, and they go round in a positive circle. Now, the main natural sources of methane are below submarine permafrost, or as what are known as marine hydrates, which we'll talk about a little more at the end, in the seas around the North Pole. Methane release from organic soils and peats in land-based permafrost areas. These are important as well as permafrost thaws, and as peat dries out, methane and CO2 are also released, and methane is also emitted from freshwater lakes where there are low oxygen levels and poorly decomposed organic matter. So all these sources are potential and actual sources of polar methane, and they are potentially huge.
And is there any evidence to suggest that methane has been an important greenhouse gas in the past?
Well, methane values did peak during the warming periods at the end of the last glaciation, between about 20 8,000 to 12,000 years before present. So methane certainly played an important role in global warming during deglaciation. But it's important to realise that the sources, though not very well known, must have been different from the present day sources of methane, because the biosphere was so completely different at that point in time. We're really saying about the past evidence is not that it's an analogue or a template which we can map onto what's happening at the present day. It simply constitutes a warning that we cannot ignore natural sources. They have been important, and there's all the evidence to suggest that they continue to be and will be important in the future. The latest source for reading more about methane is a methane tracker in 2022, https://iaea.org. It's well worth looking at that and keeping up to date with what's happening to methane. And finally, just going back to this notion of marine hydrates, these are white ice-like solids that consist of methane and water. Their stability in the polar seas is maintained by high pressure and low temperature, and the possibility of increased, well, the actual ongoing process of increased ocean temperature opens up the possibility of significant release from these marine hydrates, or clathrates as they're sometimes called, and they're one of the many aspects of methane that we need to understand and keep a note of if we are to get a proper idea of the role of methane in the future in global warming.